Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, where we take an in-depth look at how news from Taiwan is impacting the world. I'm James Chaser. Taiwan has just posted its worst quarter of economic growth since the global financial crisis, and the country has now entered a technical recession, which means 2 successive quarters of negative economic growth. With just 8 months until Taiwan's next presidential election, we're taking a look at how this weak economic data could influence the vote. To discuss all this, we're joined by Nick Marro. Nick's a lead analyst for global trade at the Economist Intelligence Unit in Hong Kong. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, James.
Nick, before we begin, I want to zoom in on some of the key figures. Preliminary data shows Taiwan's economy contracted by more than 3% in the first 3 months of this year. That followed a contraction of nearly 0.5% in the previous quarter. The weak results come as demand for Taiwan's exports, which account for a massive 70% of the country's GDP, remain depressed. Taiwan's exports have contracted every month since September last year. Nick, give us a background on this. Why is Taiwan's economy performing so badly at the moment?
Well, if you look at Taiwan's economy, a lot of it is incredibly trade reliant and export driven, specifically when it comes to semiconductors and other types of electronic and technological products and equipment. Taiwan really benefited over the past couple of years from the remote working demand that really drove global trade activity over the pandemic. As we all stayed home, there was demand for laptops and phones and TVs, but also the chips that went inside of them. And so when the world kind of got back to normal and people went back to work, back to school, it was inevitable that demand was going to subside. And consequently, activity and exports from Taiwan tied to that demand were going to soften in tandem with that. And so a lot of this should also be seen as somewhat of a correction, given that the pandemic years were a bit of a boom that were really, kind of unprecedented. So this is somewhat of a return to trend. But there's also a question there of should the DPP have been expecting this, and should they have taken the steps necessary to protect the economy, given that this slowdown was, on everyone's radar?
Yeah, we can talk about some of the kind of political implications of this in a second. But as you mentioned there, for some who look at kind of drop into the statistics every now and again, this is somewhat of a strange situation because, as you mentioned, in 2021, we had some of the strongest economic data that Taiwan has seen for a long time, and growth actually beat China for the first time in 3 decades. And now we're seeing the kind of worst performance since the global financial crisis. Like, how do we explain that massive swing that we've seen?
Yeah, well, a lot of this, again, was tied to challenges which really, derailed economic growth in a lot of other countries, but worked to Taiwan's benefit, kind of at the same time. I think the best example of this is the chip shortage, where, automotive and electronic supply chains in China or the West were really struggling from the lack of components. That was driving demand for Taiwanese production. And as a result, we saw just a boom in Taiwanese manufacturing, a boom in Taiwanese exports, a boom in Taiwanese industrial production. And that really sustained a lot of that headline economic activity that we saw in, say, 2020, 2021, for most of 2022. The key issue now is that this trend has finally come to an end. What we saw as a global chip shortage is now turning into somewhat of a global chip oversupply problem. And so that's going to be the real challenge for Taiwan as it navigates not just the next couple of months, but the next couple of quarters and maybe even a couple of years as it navigates this idea of too much supply and not enough demand.
Everything you've mentioned so far kind of relates Taiwan's economy to the international picture. And so I want to ask whether you think Taiwan's GDP is actually a useful metric for understanding how the majority of Taiwanese people here actually experience the economy. How much does Taiwan's reliance on external trade kind of impact the utility of these types of statistics?
Yeah, that's a really great question. When we look at GDP is a very informative measure when it comes to assessing the health of an economy, when it comes to making policy choices. But it doesn't necessarily mean that people are feeling the fruits of GDP in very equal ways. If you're an engineer working for a Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company, then maybe the high GDP can be reflective of the crazy levels of business that you've experienced over the past couple of years. That might translate into higher wages or bonus payouts or other things like that. But if you're operating in, say, Taiwanese service sectors, say, the restaurants or the domestic tourism industry, then the growth that we saw since 2020 hasn't necessarily kind of trickled down and affected you. I think when we take a broader look at things like wage growth or employment growth, we see it very much skewed towards the ICT sector and the tech manufacturing sector. And so when you talk to the average Taiwanese person, you can mention GDP figures all you like, but unless it's had a real impact on can they pay their rent, can they afford their mortgage, can they send their kids to school, the questions and the answers there can be very different.
I'm glad you mentioned some of those really kind of key issues, because now we're going to zoom out and take a look at how this economic data could impact Taiwan in an election year. After Taiwan's latest GDP data was released, Taiwan's opposition party, the Kuomintang or KMT, posted this on their Facebook. The green line shows Taiwan's economic growth, which is lower than other countries in the region. The text above the chart roughly translates as Taiwan's economy hasn't grown, but prices have risen, and that Taiwan's governing Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, has left the economy in a shambles. Nick, Taiwan may be the worst performing in this chart, but other export-dependent countries in East Asia are also not doing that great as well. Is what we're seeing now really the fault of the DPP itself?
Well, you can make an argument either way, and I think the KMT was going to criticize whatever the DPP did, given that it's an election year. But if we kind of zoom out and look at the wider region, the trade story is a similar one for South Korea, it's similar for Vietnam, it's similar for a number of other East Asian markets, and that's really just a signal that demand is changing, mostly falling, and that's a factor which is really hard for governments of the region to kind of control. I mean, the DPP can't engineer external demand out of nowhere. I think the validity of the criticism is the DPP should have been expecting this. The last 2 years, 2+ years in terms of really crazy trade growth, I mean, anyone really should have expected that this was an outlier, that we would inevitably return to trend, and that as part of that return to trend, there was going to be a painful adjustment to the fact that things aren't going to be as rosy as they were in, say, the later half of 2020 or throughout most of 2021. The question here is, did the DPP take the necessary steps to prepare the economy or the Taiwanese population for that return to trend? And I think that's what the KMT is going to really try and focus on as we head up to the elections in January next year.
And this question, my next question, relates to something I asked earlier, but of course GDP is just one metric of how we measure how an economy is performing, and Taiwan's GDP per capita, for example, has now recently surpassed South Korea and it's already ahead of Japan. How do we explain that differential?
Sure. I mean, well, if you look at GDP per capita, it's just kind of an arithmetic formula that looks at how big is the GDP divided by the total population. And we should remember that Taiwan has a much smaller population than South Korea and Japan. So, in a sense, Taiwan overtaking these two countries in terms of GDP per capita, that was inevitable. That should have happened. And when we kind of dial it down into the segments of society which are really, reflecting these gains, it's very uneven. For those people who are working in, say, mom and pop stores, or they're working in domestic services industries, these industries which have really been hit by the pandemic and Taiwan's closed borders for the greater half of 2-3 years, what does that really mean for you? We can cite the figures around GDP per capita as much as we want, but if people aren't seeing their basic needs met, their basic financial demands addressed as a result of the broader macroeconomic situation, then those statistics don't really matter.
And what do you think the upshot of all of this is? How do you think the two main political parties are going to position themselves on the economy as the election approaches?
Well, I think the easy answer is what the KMT is going to do, given that the KMT is in a very kind of easy spot right now to criticize the DPP on this very recent economic data. It's likely going to say that this is the fault of the ruling party. This is evidence that the DPP's stewardship of the economy isn't very sophisticated. I don't think that's necessarily a fair argument, given that Taiwan has recorded record levels of growth and record rates of growth over the past couple of years. But the big problem for the DPP is, are you going to be able to use the track record of the last 2 years to convince people this year that your stewardship of the economy is still very much intact? I think the DPP is going to try and do that. They're going to point to the fact that Taiwan was able to get through the pandemic much better than many of its regional neighbors. They're going to point to other things like Taiwan's closer relationship with the U.S. And its enhanced role in supply chains as evidence of the DPP maintaining and expanding Taiwan's international profile. But at the end of the day, the question is, are voters really going to be sympathetic to that?
There's some that say the emphasis in Taiwan's politics on relations with China, which is also, of course, Taiwan's largest trading partner, limits the space for a really rich debate about economic policy and how Taiwan's economy is working. When you look at the two main political parties in Taiwan, do you see a genuine difference in how they approach the economy? And for example, how would you imagine the KMT would respond to the criticism that you were just talking about? I mean, what would the KMT do differently to mitigate the situation we've just seen?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually quite a challenge for both parties to position themselves here, given how tricky the issue of Taiwan's relationship with China actually is. I mean, the KMT, for a long time, has been defaulting to this narrative that tighter cross-strait economic linkages are better. They're going to, bring a lot more wealth and prosperity to Taiwan because China is Taiwan's largest trading partner. It is an incredibly important economic entity that is not going away anytime soon. At the same time, this is coming at a time when China is enhancing its harassment of Taiwan. Political relations between the two sides are at a very, very low point. There's a high degree of skepticism among the broader Taiwanese public in terms of China's ambitions towards Taiwan, as well as the ideas of, a Taiwanese versus Chinese identity. And so the political pitfalls around that economic arguments are just very, very real. Take that argument and flip it, and that's the issue facing the DPP. Where the DPP is saying, hey, we want to keep China at arm's length because of all these political reasons, but at the same time, DPP knows that it can't ignore China given China's importance to the island. And as a result, this is essentially going to be both sides arguing on different sides of the coin. And it's going to be, I think, a very interesting thing for us to witness in terms of these electoral dynamics.
Do you think that could mean third parties now in Taiwan could perform a little bit better? I mean, you mentioned they're the two sides of the same coin. Is there a third face to the coin that a third party could offer when it comes to the economy that could really kind of cut through with Taiwanese voters, do you think?
Sure. I mean, I think third parties in Taiwanese politics are definitely a theme for us to watch, particularly the younger generation feels increasingly disillusioned by what the DPP and the KMT are offering. But I think at this moment, what third parties can really offer is still very much focused on, maybe issue or topic specific kind of questions or issues that are very much relegated to the political sphere. At least my own monitoring, we haven't seen anything from third parties which represent a break in the current orthodoxy around, say, economic policy or Taiwan's economic policy abroad. They're very, very much focused on kind of Taiwan's domestic issues. Of course, you do have some discussion around things like labor rights and higher wages and employment opportunities, which feed into this discussion. But in terms of supplanting what the DPP or even what the KMT is offering in terms of economic policy by these third parties, I don't really think we're all that there yet. But we might be in a couple of years for sure.
And then just a final question before we finish up. I kind of want to turn the question around because international observers who are looking at presidential elections in Taiwan so often want to know what the candidates have to say about China because it's very obvious how that impacts Taiwan's position in the world. But much less attention is paid to how the presidential candidates are positioning themselves on the economy and how that could also actually impact Taiwan's position in the world. What impact does a weak Taiwanese economy have on those questions, on Taiwan's standing in the world?
Yeah, I mean, the question of, I guess, weakness in the Taiwanese economy is, I would say, much more relevant for domestic voters because it influences how the voters are ultimately going to vote. And that's really the big linkage that it has to the international kind of framework here. If we're looking at the kind of economic weaknesses which are currently plaguing Taiwan, there is a potential for the KMT to make some severe inroads there. It's questions over the economy which ultimately could end up deciding who is going to be the next president of Taiwan. And then that in turn leads to Taiwan's changing relationship on the global stage, whether that's its relationship with China or its relationship with the US or other partners. And so fundamentally, these issues are incredibly important. They're not the only or maybe arguably not even the most important issues, particularly for a presidential election, but there's something that which we can't discount. And even if people think that the DPP is going to retain the presidency in 2024, weakness over the economy could create a bit of a surprise and put the KMT in a much stronger position than people are giving them credit for.
Nick, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really great conversation. And thank you to our viewers too. This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. You can find TaiwanPlus on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next time.